What's up, guys? So this is the second presentation of a series that I'm going to do. In the last one, we talked about basically the history of Western philosophy, not in its entirety, but just in the context of how it's formed our current sort of dominant worldview. To point out that there are certain aspects of that uh, worldview which have not been addressed or reconsidered for hundreds of years that served a pragmatic purpose in terms of preserving science and its authority, and the ability of scientists to continue on their work of recording information and making observations and making new theories, and also mathematicians and physicists keep on doing what they're doing. But at a fundamental level, there are rationalistic and logical problems with the nature of the way that we are uh, framing the world abstractly that lead to a massive amount of confusion when it comes to now having the hindsight of the effects of all that scientific work and the increases in technology that have given us levels of information which now require a new way of thinking about the nature of reality that fundamentally are causing a bunch of paradoxical thoughts, right? So I'm going to run through the sorts of problems that are coming up. And this is common knowledge now. When I sort of discovered this, or it crossed my mind in 2017, it was not so apparent. So I've been in the background, sort of just really applying things to my life and looking at all the implications of this way of thinking, which I'm going to present. And it's not my theory. All I'm doing is putting together information in order to show you something that's clear, that will be clear to your conscious experience, that you can then apply in terms of understanding all these new theories that are coming up, and to give you a bunch of clarity and also power in your life. This is an extremely empowering way of understanding the nature of reality that's supported by the new information which we have, and you'll see all this in coming. So basically, I'm going to run through the the problems that we're facing in terms of all the paradoxical conclusions and all the madness that people are talking about, and then I'm going to show how that's all underlied by one simple mistake in the way that we're framing abstractly the nature of reality that you can literally discover just by observing your experience. And then I'm going to run into the implications of all that. So it's very interesting. It's worth sticking around. I'm going to do my best to explain it. I didn't take the sort of staying in university route to become a professor. So like the level of uh, evidence based detail that I'm going to give, it might be a little bit on the looser end. If you're looking for someone who's like a professor, then go to a university. But in the end of the day, as you can see from the last presentation, we're not able to get certain answers out of certain structures when there's authority which is based on knowledge and the truth of the knowledge. Because when there are points and there are realities and true facts that go in the face of the whole established hierarchy of information, then there's going to be people holding on to that. So this is called the missing model. AI named it. I'm not too bothered about all the sort of. I'm just trying to get across to you the details so you can apply it to your life and really have a deeper understanding of the nature of reality in a way that is totally intuitively applicable. Like it makes sense. Okay, so we're going to run through a lot of stuff here, but it's worth sticking around. So check it out. All right. We've got a lot of problems right now. We're running into these paradoxes that have literally run through the nature of philosophy for so long, and it's things like free will and determinism, the mind and matter, like how are they connected. We talked about a lot of this. Time, the paradox of finality and time that we experience versus eternity, the reality of eternity and infinity, and then the individual human versus the idea of higher conscious or divinity, right? Like all these problems fundamentally are underwritten by the way that we're viewing the difference between matter and consciousness, the way that we're uh, the way that we're laying out the structure of reality is causing all these paradoxical thoughts, right? Because if you look at it in a different way, it's not a paradox at all, and that's what we're going to look at. So all of them fundamentally, I argue, and there's two things that we're going to look at, right? We're going to look at a different model of time, which comes directly from just a pure experience, purely it. from a logical level, right? You have to admit and you have to recognize that all of the information that anyone can possibly have comes from their conscious experience, whether uh, everything is mediated through our consciousness, right? So if we want to understand true facts, we have to look to what our consciousness gives us, right? This theory of time is really fundamentally based on epistemology, because if you look at consciousness, it gives us two different types of facts. Okay. Let me just go through the slides quick because I'm going to do that. But what we're looking at here, you have to bear in mind at this point, is we're looking at a different way of uh, organizing the conscious data that we get, right? Little spoiler, it has to do with quality versus quantity, and which one is actually the primary form of information, and what's the logical justification behind that. Okay, so all of these are based, all literally the majority of the truths that we have are based on this model that we talked about. It comes from Newton, it comes from Descartes, it comes from an amalgamation of these different theories that were taken to be truths, and they were adopted into the organizational structure as a pragmatic way to keep this machine going, which has done an amazing job of producing technology. But obviously we're in this state right now where we've got all the technology in the world, but everyone's fucking ending their own lives and crazy stuff like that, because while this what we have is very good for understanding or just pragmatically building stuff in the material world, because we're modeling things in a certain way, it forces us to make conclusions in our own model of ourselves that undermines the nature of our existence, basically. And it's weird, but it's true that we can look at exactly how the model of linear time and the mistake of the false hierarchization of quality and quantity, literally are at the root of this complete misunderstanding of the way reality works. And the thing about this is, if you absorb what I say, or if you go and read the books that I mention, and really absorb this way of thinking, you will see a number of things. First off, it's like it messes with your head, because we've been taught to think about things in a certain way. So when you go and try to think about things in a different way, it's like, what do you do with this information? The second thing is that you'll see that it gives you a huge amount of insight into Eastern philosophies and ancient belief systems and ways of modeling reality, because it fits with that. It also it really clearly gives you the explanation of how do they know this stuff. You see, like, I mean, if you've looked into any of the ancient cultures, which is becoming very in vogue, and I'm not talking about the building, I'm talking about the philosophies. There are certain things, and even their ability to, like, for example, the Mayan time, right? How did they know stuff? How did they come to these conclusions that are true? How did they arrive at these what seem like impossible conclusions? All of that. The reason why for us it's how is that possible is because of the way we're structuring our minds. And we're looking at the theory of time here, but you have to bear in mind that this has a lot to do with the difference between quantity and quality, and how those are actually uh, either superior or inferior in terms of their evidentiary credibility, right? So, okay, let's go on the next one. Next one. Linear time. Okay, so we have to, if we, when we model time as a line, there are a couple of conclusions that come naturally, right? First is that moments are like points on the line. Okay, they are infinitesimal. They are fixed units, and they're uniform. That's one thing that you have to literally assume is the case of reality, and we'll see that basically is it's nonsensical if you really look at the way things are. And at the fact that time being a line, what you get is by modeling it this way, and then just by the nature of our brains work, when we create a model, since our brains are designed fundamentally as tools for bodies to survive in reality, once we take on a mental model, the function of a mental model is in order to pre-form behavior, right? So when we're modeling our environment around us and we're learning about the interactions between different things, all of that is programmed and basically formed in order to help our survival, in terms of for us to be able to preform actions, and then to take those actions, and they're going to play out the way that we expect so that we can survive. And our brains are very good at that. But you have to, when we're talking about these sort of abstract theories and remodeling stuff like things like time, if we create a model of time that says that time is a line, the implication of that time being a line is that also, if it's an infinite line that stretches on forever, all the points are unique moments, and it's infinite, then that means that the future is already given. The past and the future, everything is already given now, which is what basically justifies determinism. You can say if time is a line, then the future is already out there somewhere, and it's already determined because time is our uniform points. We can measure that time is like that, so therefore, then the future is already created. So therefore, things must be determined. And it's interesting how extreme mechanism and extreme sort of idealism both lead to extreme determinism. But what I'm going to present to you, and you will see, is basically it's founded and it's totally supported by what we are through our ability to compute massive amounts of data using computers. You can see that this is a very good explanation of the model of reality because of the our actual data, that it's not like that. It's not determined the way that a linear the linear model of time would suggest, and it's actually quite different. But it's totally exactly intuitively understandable because basically our minds are always modeling nature and reality. So our intuition already knows on an unconscious level how the universe works. It's just we're trying to create linguistic models to that are accurate enough for that allow us to further our understanding by giving us the ability to abstractly, mentally manipulate these pieces. Okay, so why does linear time not fail? Why does the idea of linear time, why is that incomprehensible? Really, well, if you think about it, if time is built of individual units that are uniform, and they are all non motion, then there could be no movement. Basically, time itself, all that time is movement and change. The fundamental requirement of any description of time is that it is in motion, right? So individual units that have no quality to them or are fundamentally just fixed points don't have any motion to them. It's just just on a practical level, it's not the right way of conceiving of it. It may work for measurement, and that's great, and that may work for many different types of equations. But on a fundamental level, if we're saying that this is a good way of measuring time so that we can do pragmatically things, that's great. But if we're saying this is what time is, the linear model is not accurate, because in reality, time itself, what's fundamental to it is that it endures. It has the quality of enduring in terms of Bergson, and I'm picking this up from Bergson because it's a brilliant argument, and it hasn't really gotten the type of it hasn't been absorbed as fully into our collective understanding, although it has on the unconscious level, because he was extremely popular in his time. This Time and Free Will, his first sort of big book, was written in like 1911, and he was one of the most popular philosophers. Like apparently he was like one of the first celebrity thinkers in history, at least in the West, and people would queue all the way down, some big road in France to listen to his lectures. Like he inspired so many of the thinkers who have inspired, been very popular. But the thing is that after the Second World War, and so much trauma in society collectively, and the death of so many of the intelligent people in the world, there was a sort of reframing of intellectual mastery and intellectual culture that basically glorified the people who created the theories that invented the technology that won the war, if you know what I'm saying, right? So Einstein was in that, and Bergson himself had specific critiques of Einstein's work based on this theory of time. So we're going to go now into the real theoretical stuff, okay? But you have to understand that the linear model of time, just on a basic level, while for measurement and practical applications in terms of like velocity and trajectories and stuff like that, it works. On bodies, simple things moving at set speeds, it works. But when it comes to the real nature of experience, there's something else going on. And what we have to understand is it's an epistemological error. We're talking about epistemology, meaning how the theory of knowledge, how do we establish true facts? There's an epistemological error that's happening between quality. There's two. We have to understand that I don't think anyone else really brought this up in Western philosophy. I'm sure there are Eastern people who have done this thousands of years ago, but Bergson was the first person to really identify this, which is the nature of quantity and quality themselves, right? And which one is primary? Because quality and quantity are two fundamentally different forms of information that we can have in our minds and we can experience. The question is which one of those is primary, and that is the key thing that really differentiates a different theory. That when we go on, I'm going to explain it, but you have to follow on to see how that has actually been vindicated by using mathematics. And interestingly, Bergson was a mathematician. Also, Whitehead, who I don't know if I mentioned in the other lecture, was a mathematician who also created this process-based philosophies. Leibniz, who I definitely mentioned, was a mathematician who had a very similar sort of conclusions. Because I don't know what it is, but there's many people who are mathematicians who have gone on to create theories that are at the time, say, because we're seeing from the benefit of hindsight, and we're seeing the biases of the past when they talk about stuff being mystical and this and that. But what that just basically means is that it provides an account that doesn't make human consciousness the only exceptional consciousness, because it doesn't have to deal it doesn't because it doesn't basically agree with Descartes' conclusion that only humans have like God's consciousness and all other things are just material, right? Which is what the underlying assumption has been for science for so long. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the real theoretical stuff that gives you a different theory and model of time. Then we're going to talk about how that's supported and vindicated by modern technology and the use of computers to calculate insanely large numbers of problems which couldn't have been done by humans. And then we're going to see how that basically brings insane amount of clarity to these paradoxes that we're running into now that we're having this sort of blooming of mystical and indigenous thinking. Okay, so quantity and quality. So this is the core of the argument, and it comes from the logical starting point that our only access to anything is through our conscious experience. So if we look at our conscious experience, what do we get? Fundamentally, what we have is we have pure qualitative experience in time, right? If we look around, moments or anything, the only way that we can isolate anything at all is by selectively and sequentially focusing our attention on different parts of what is a field. If you look around at the room right now, what you have is a field of qualities. You have all these feelings. You have your current emotional state. You have lots of visual imagery. But what is the case about this is that all the qualitative aspects of experience are interspersed. They are there's a field of colors, shapes, and feelings, and different points of attention, and they are all literally, what the word he uses is interpenetrating, because there's not really words for this stuff, but it's all blended together. It's one field of information. Okay, in order for us to talk about anything, to use language, to create symbols, to have any hope of using language whatsoever, what is necessary is that we have to uh, isolate specific parts of this field of experience and then lay that into a mental field. This is like Kant's part, because what he was doing is fundamentally making a critique, not a critique of Kant saying he's wrong, but saying, look, this part you need to account for. We have to extract pieces into a mental field, essentially like a grid-like field, and then isolate them. So what our consciousness does in order to create language, in order to create theories and all this stuff, is to cut pieces out of an undifferentiated field of qualities and then lay them into an abstract uh, field of quantity. Now, the reason quantity comes into this is because in order to literally create the idea of a number, you need to do this process. You need to say, the example Bergson uses is a metronome. If you want to count the ticks on the metronome, there's no separate ticks. There's one experience that's going on of this thing moving back and forth. But what you have to do is that at each, you choose an arbitrary point. When it goes to one side, it's one. When it goes to the other side, it's two. Um, that's the next one. So it's back and forth. You literally, over a period of duration time, you are picking out these points, and you're basically putting them in a little thing in your mind that is accumulating them all and putting a number to it, right? The same goes for any sort of numbering, any sort of quantitizing. If you have four things on the ground, what you have to do is isolate each one of those things and then put it into a field, and then you give for numbers, you give them a name, right? Each one, two, three, four. These numbers represent things that are initially in a field of quality. Okay, now if we want to understand time, there's a very interesting point that Bergson's making, because this is, so we understand that quality is the primary experience. Quality is undifferentiated, but it has intensities. It doesn't have magnitude, in terms of, it doesn't have a different. You don't say, if I'm using more force to push on a lever or something, it's not that it's five times. It's not five more. It's not a thing of magnitude from if I'm pushing lightly or I'm pushing hard. It's a totally different experience. What you're experiencing is more muscle movement and large. It's hard to say it without using quantity related terms, but you're experiencing something different. There's a different intensity of the physical sensations that you're feeling. It's not related to magnitude. It's related to intensity, and intensity is related to quality, whereas magnitude is related to quantity. Okay, so if we want to understand how we experience time as what it is, what we see is that time itself, if we want to think about a length of time, it had if we so we live through it, and then when we get to the end of it, we experience it all at once, and it has a qualitative dimension to it. It has a qualitative aspect. He uses the example of a song. If you listen to a song and you say, do you like that song or do you not like that song, what do you think about that song? It's not that you go and look at all the different sounds and all the different parts in separately and decide whether or not it's good or bad. What you do is it's at the end of the song or during the song, you're taking in the whole, and it's giving you an impression. And that means that emotional feelings, time is more like a feeling than it is like a number. Okay, and that sounds trivial, but it's really not trivial, because if you when we go further, you'll see how you can use this in order to formulate it in a way that is quantifiable by mathematics, but just by a different form of model. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So the foundational error that this is making by mistaking quality and quantity, right, is that we are applying a quantitative measure to time, but time in itself being a qualitative field and being a requirement, the field of time is a requirement to create number itself. So to use number as the way of modeling time is actually it's a mistake in terms. It's an error of epistemological error. You can't use you can't use the number as the primary model of the thing which is required for number to be created. Right. An error of abstraction, and when we go and then assume that time is this linear and number based. But when I say linear, this is the thing. Time does appear to progress in forward motion, right? That's not what I mean by linear. And I think a lot of people, like, you hear a lot of people say time is nonlinear, but when you listen to what I'm going to say next, you will actually understand what that means, and you'll see how it's not just like this headfucky thing. It's actually true. It is true, but it's not linear in the sense that it doesn't go forward. It's the linearity in terms of each moment, each second adds on the same amount of time quantitatively in an arithmetic way. That there's one piece of time and two pieces of time and three pieces of time and four pieces of time, and the extent of time passing is just this adding on of addition of each new unit. It's different. Okay, so we need to look at, okay, this is confusing probably, But if we take this on board, we need to now look at how can we model time, how can we take on this quantity quality distinction and how do we actually understand time and what does that mean for everything else. So that's what we're going to look at next. Okay, so when we take in account this quantity quality distinction, we accept the fact that time itself is one a primary it's a primary underlying necessity in order to create number itself. So therefore, and to create abstraction whatsoever. So any abstract model of time that is using purely number based simple arithmetic form in order to represent it is a misapplication of logic, right? It's illogical. It's like trying to build a house out of a house. I don't know give an analogy for it, but it's an illogical conclusion, right? So what does that mean? If time isn't aligned, how can we represent it? We need to look back at what do we actually experience with time. Time itself, how do we know it's past? We have accumulation, right? We know as time goes on, our memory accumulates. We accumulate all these different shifts of attention. We take something in, oh, look over there, take it on, look over there, take it on, oh, I did this task, that task, this task, I walked over there, movement. And that gets accumulated in memory, and then at any given point in the present, we can look back on that memory. And as things are happening and things are accumulating, it appears to be longer and more information. Okay. How can we possibly model that? What does that even reflect? And the interesting thing, right, is this is now we're going to bring in a computer model, which everybody's heard of and is a little bit on the sort of woo woo, whoa, trippy hippie side, but is actually incredibly useful and it it's it explains why these things are so sort of loved by mystical hippie types, and it also explains why it is that they do what they do and they're so incredible. So the better model of time is the nonlinear function. Okay, so for example, what is a nonlinear function? Like I said, time linearity, it's going to make sense now when someone says time is nonlinear, and they're talking craziness, but you will actually know what that means because it is true, but it's not in the way that everyone says it. Okay, time is modeled like a nonlinear function, like for example a Fibonacci sequence, right? Which is interesting because again, these things are mirrored in nature, but what is it that makes time like this? Okay, think about it. The way the Fibonacci sequence or other nonlinear functions, fractals, work is this. Um, Say, if you want to calculate the Fibonacci sequence, what do? You say 1 plus 2 equals 3. 3 plus 2 equals 5. 5 plus 3 equals 8. 8 plus 5 equals 13. That's the sequence. So what are you doing? You are doing an equation, and then that equation takes the output from the last equation as an input for the next equation. Okay, so as time goes on, the output of all the units of time or the effects that are happening are inputted into the present, and then those affect, because of the way, say for example, you have memories, those memories affect your future actions. So at each point, each step on the line requires that things be all the past has to accumulate into the present moment, and that needs to be added into the next equation that then creates the next step, and then each part is stepped, and it goes on like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about why this is interesting, but this is just the case. I hope you can see how this is the case. That time is not an arithmetic line. It's not a 1 plus 2 times plus 3 times plus. It's not arithmetic. It's non-linear in the way that you would model it mathematically. Okay, which is a fractal. Okay, so now we need to talk a little bit about fractals because we need to talk about how the modeling of these equations, which was impossible, right? Because back in the day, if someone had to go and do all the calculations by hand in order to make a 3D sort of model that we get of the way the fractals form, it would take a lifetime. It would take one person from the age of 10 years old until 100 years old, doing it every day, probably even more. It would take multiple people's lifetimes in order just to make a very simple illustration of what these things look like, to get the insight that we get by modeling them, when we can see that these things actually mirror natural forms. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. We're going to talk about fractals, and we're going to bring it all together, and you're going to see how this literally affects free will. Maybe some of you already intuited that the question of free will, time and eternity, the higher and lower forms of consciousness, all this stuff is literally concluded and given an answer to, that is scientifically valid, and given through experience as well, that creates an intuitive understanding of the nature of ourselves and how we relate to the universe in a way that's basically kind of underwhelming. But for those of you who are, if you're watching this, if you watch any of my content and connected with it, then you are a very logical person, and you need the justification for you just to believe the things that are given to you by experience. But when you do take this all on board, it's incredibly freeing, it's incredibly empowering, and also it gives you the sense of knowing, like that, that what your experience is valid, and it can take you into very deep places in terms of what we call the growth of consciousness expansion. This is the thing that will shut up the logical mind, because this is the case. And it again, from starting here, you can go into all the old mystical traditions and get an incredibly deeper level of understanding that will fit in with your logical scientific programming. Okay, so the fractal. Okay, we're going to talk now just about interesting things that happen when you model fractals, and I would really suggest that any of you who's watching this and who are interested do this, that you go to a fractal generator, one that has the visualization, and you zoom in and out, because what you get, right, when you look at a fractal is which is just a nonlinear function. This is just calculating based on these principles, where you take the input of the last output, and then you do it again, and input of the last output and do it again, which is a model of the way the time works. But when you zoom in and out of fractals, you get this really interesting thing that happens, right? As all you're doing is changing in scale and in size. If you're zooming in, all you're doing is assuming that you're getting smaller. If you're zooming out, all you're doing is changing your reference frame, the size of your frame of reference. And this is all super critical to explaining all this other stuff. As you change the size of your frame of reference, being your viewpoint, what you get is this alternating of what we see as coherent forms, and then you go in further and they sort of break apart and become sort of disoriented, in terms of it goes to sort of like space. Or you can do this in your mind if you imagine like zooming into your hand and zooming in on the cells, and what would happen, you'd get to a point where they all split apart and you get smaller and smaller until you go into one, and then it reaches coherence again. But what happens is you see these inter layered and layers of coherence and incoherence, right? And why is that significant? And also that they're self-similar. So you have layers of coherence at one scale that looks a certain way. Then you have incoherence, or sort of breaking apart and abstraction, as from our perspective, being that we are these sort of physical forms that have a coherent bounds. What we perceive as coherence, we see incoherence for a period of scale, and then as we get smaller to a certain again, maybe a ratio of that is harmonic, or it's similar ratio to the other layer of coherence, you see coherence again in slightly different in terms of the qualities, because they'll use colors to represent different things, but it's the same forms are created in these alternating layers of coherence to incoherence, coherence to incoherence, as you zoom in or zoom out in terms of expanding or contracting in size and scale, which is just, again, your frame of reference. So it's interesting. What do we see? We see alternating fields of coherence, and we see self-similarity at different scales, okay? So what does this mean? Okay, so now this is where we're modeling based on a new mathematical framework for what time is. We're modeling that, and we're seeing that there's these different this pattern, which is just a mathematical thing, which we also see all over in nature. I'm just over explaining this so that you can understand how this fits, right? Because now if we use that as a mental model to understand the universe, okay? what does that lead to? And everybody's noticing this, but I'm just putting this together in this way so that it's really clear that this is a truth. And it's and to take away the mystification that some people use as a sales tactic, and to also take away the absolute certainty that some people also use in their own way as a sales tactic to keep their jobs and keep their sort of stature in society, to get to the point of what does this mean. So if we're assuming that nonlinear functions or fractal mathematics is literally the model that describes time that we know from our experience. We see that when we model these things just using numbers, we get this effect that as you change in size, you see coherence, incoherence, incoherence, coherence. How can we then um, abstract from that in order to understand more about the nature of life and ourselves and how it all fits together? Okay, so this is where we're going to get into uh, extrapolation. So we see, if we when we're observing nature, that we have all these observations now, along with computers to model stuff. We have observations, like just so much time of observation. We've observed the nature of cells, unicellular life, right? Even within cells, organelles. Within cells form tissues, tissues form organs, organs form our bodies form societies, our societies are a part of an ecosystem, right? We see that. But if we use the abstract model and we apply it at each scale, what does that mean? So this is what we're going to look at, is what what we see basically is that at scales where we identify coherence, right? That doesn't mean that the interstitial spaces don't have coherence. It's just that to our the way that our consciousness is working in this field that we're in, that's what we recognize as coherence. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the case that in those incoherent spaces there isn't another logic that makes sense. But at the coherent spaces, what do we see? We see things, bodies that have they have a definite boundary. They literally sit within a field. They do actions. They take in stuff. They excrete stuff, and their collective actions creates. They have characteristic actions within their field that they just do over and over again. They're born. They do their thing. They navigate their space, and then they die. And that's what we see from organelles in cells to cells in tissues, tissues in bodies. Tissues and organs, organs and bodies, to I think organs are a little bit of a stretch, but at least in the case of cells and organelles, and if we look at unicellular life, we see all it's the on a qualitative level, we see the same stuff that we see if we were to look at our behavior from a larger perspective. Okay, so what can we infer from that? The next question is, what do we infer? So we have to describe what a coherent, we see these coherent units, and I basically just described it. What they do, uh, so on an abstract level, we have fields that within which coherent units or conduct themselves, basically, right? So cells or single cell organisms, they have some form of memory, they exchange with the environment, they seek out certain substances or certain inputs, they create characteristic outputs. They have a boundary that separates them from the rest of the environment, and they literally live little lives, and that's observable from our perspective. We can see that, but we don't we have a blockage about making the logical leap to say that these things are conscious, because we are seeing conscious from our perspective, which is where I needed to throw in that thing to understand the fractal generator. And then now we need to understand, how can we model consciousness to account for this stuff? How can we use this theory to make time fit into everything? And this is where we go into the extrapolation. So what do we have? We have the evidence, from the purest form of evidence, that time itself, the way that it accumulates and the way that it eats, and that the accumulated effective time in memory is then added into the present to make new forms, and then that at each stage is progressively increased, and that increase is always added into the next form of present. Then we have to use a nonlinear function best to describe the way that the universe grows, basically moves, which is obvious. It's so obvious. It's literally so obvious, because if you just look qualitatively at the way that nonlinear functions turn out, we see it all over the place. We literally we can see when we model larger scales of of the universe, we see that it's shaped like neurons, right? This is an artifact of the way that time works, because time works non-linearly. But that doesn't mean that it's a big all hippy trippy, oh yeah, everything's now and it's all that. And I'm not saying that there isn't truth to that, but what I'm saying is that's more of a mystification than to actually see what that means, which is that nature is fractal, because time, the fractal, is actually just an image of time mathematically using quantity. It's the best quantitative image. It's not arithmetic. It's it's nonlinear. It's a nonlinear function. Okay, so that being the case, if we then use our incredible ability to compute, now that we have computers, and to calculate, and then we calculate these functions out, and we observe what we see, what we get is that this nested self-similar, scale-independent self-similarity, where at certain ratios, I'm assuming, I don't know if that's true, but at certain points there are repetitions of form. Okay, and that if we then extract that to say, what does that mean if we put it into a real life application? What does that mean? It means that the cells of our body act in a similar way on an abstract level as we do. Okay, and within cells, organelles act in a similar way. Within tissues act a similar way within organs, and they all do different parts, and they interact differently, and they all have a limit, a specific time span, and that is applicable to us as well. This is the abstract model of a coherent unit on a fractal scale. Okay, so we need to understand, what does this say about consciousness, and how do we fit that in? Because this is the question. This is the big question that's coming up. Panpsychism is becoming a thing, but I want to really clarify it to you so it makes sense in a way that this is a perspective change, which is basically characteristic of the paradigm shift that's happening now. And as Karl Popper, the guy who invented the word paradigm, said, basically, a paradigm shift, it's not a linear accumulation of information. It's not that, oh, yes, all the discoveries led to a new theory. No, he said that the theories change in science as a series of funerals, not as a series of discoveries, meaning that as the old guard dies off, the new theory comes in. And this new theory is what I'm talking about now. And it has to do with the collective understanding, just through observation, that of the nature of the self-similarity factor. Now what I'm doing is I'm using this model that we've just created, or I've just explained. I didn't create it, I'm just explaining it, of how consciousness, how our minds function, how that creates our time, how time is nonlinear, how nonlinear functions show us these certain factors about the nature of reality, and then how do we then reapply that to understand consciousness at scales. Okay, so that's next. What then do we do? How do we use this to understand consciousness? Are cells consciousness? Do they have consciousness? Do others? Is there consciousness at smaller scales? I say yes, absolutely. And this is a logical necessity. And hear me out on this, okay? In order for substance, material, to exist at all, the fundamental necessity is that each substance uh, resists its resists other substance. The fundamental necessity for things to exist in a material way is that they resist one another, which requires, on the most basic level, that they have a form of self-consciousness. And I'm not, this is what I'm saying. We need to now learn to differentiate between what we call consciousness or awareness, right? What we find it hard, right? There's a very difficult logical thing for people to do, to imagine what the consciousness is like of a substance or something like that, right? And that's because we are mistaking our experience of human awareness being with just simple awareness itself, right? We are an awareness. We are seeing the all the accumulated memory within a human body, right? Within a human mind. We at this scale, with this set of tasks that humans do in terms of our capacities to act on the world, we accumulate a certain amount of memory in order to make that the case, because we play a metabolic role in the larger thing that we're a part of, right? So as a fundamental necessity, the only way that anything can exist and have resistance in terms of, in a material sense, is that it must literally identify between itself and another. And we call that structural material. But what I'm saying is we need to simplify our understanding of what that is. Okay. And that is a necessity. So For it to exist, it has to resist. For it to resist, it has to have some sense of what's it and what's not it, right? So on a basic level, if you can't go that far, you can at least go far enough to understand that for a cell to act and do what it does, it needs to literally be aware of its environment. Awareness itself is a very, very subtle but simple thing. All these mystical traditions and all of the contemplative practices and basically all religions are looking at how do you identify yourself with awareness rather than identifying with your human form, because awareness itself is just, it's literally a field. It's a condition. Awareness itself is a condition that's required for us to be conscious, but our consciousness itself is different from awareness because we are aware of with if we want to differentiate it this way, the consciousness, I just said it, the literally what our awareness within the human form is aware of is the all the accumulated memories and impressions that we've had through our life, combined with the scale that we're at and our sensory apparatuses, right? But the awareness itself is different from that. Okay, the awareness is different from the actual what it's aware of, which is within the brain. So it's like this difference between consciousness and brain activity, or the awareness itself is the simple act of being aware, and at a cellular level it has a different field. But we have to, we don't need to say it's true, but we can infer just on his behavior if we're using this model to understand things, and we can see that basically, mathematically speaking, that's how time works, and time works through our memory and accumulation. Then basically we can say that cells themselves will have an awareness that is aware of a cell's field. It's aware of a field, and that field, it's limited by its scale and what it's actually doing, as are we. So this is the interesting part. Our is that the next one? Our 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 consciousness itself is scale dependent. Okay, awareness is uniform across, because the literal pure awareness itself doesn't is not connected necessarily to what it's aware of. Okay, but it's instantiated within us at this size because we are a coherent thing that has a metabolic purpose in this larger process. Just like all of our, if you touch something, all the neurons in your finger are creating the sensation that en masse accumulated gives us the impression of our feeling. But the neurons themselves are doing the sensing for us, right? But we're accumulating that in our minds, and we are aware of that from our perspective as one coherent unit who has acts at this scale with these purposes, and that's it. So we need to understand that at different scales, it's very plausible that awareness and consciousness are part of it, but just limited to what they're doing, to what the scale of it is, to what the extent of the memory is that's required at that scale. But awareness itself is a part of that because it's a requirement, it's a necessity, right? It needs to be there for that to work. Okay. This is what I was just explaining in the last one, and I couldn't see if this was the next slide. Just like it's difficult for us to intuit what it might be like to the consciousness of a cell, right? We just can't do it, or it's very difficult. We can infer that it's there, but we can't do it. But because of what I was just explaining, in the sense that our awareness that's within us that we identify, well, we don't really identify with our awareness. And this is where we later on will get into all the spiritual stuff. But our awareness itself is aware of 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 all the memory our brain accumulates based on its field of perception and its purposes, right? We pick out what we need in order to get to where we're trying to go and do what we're trying to do. And so at different scales, the awareness of a cell is limited and required to what its purposes are and the scale that it's acting on. Same with an organelle, right? It'll be aware, it'll be drawn to be aware of certain things by its physiological structure, but the awareness is there. There's still the sort of focusing on certain things to perform certain tasks as a requirement. Okay. Likewise, if we get to trying to understand on larger scales of consciousness, we we have to also accept the reality that based on our human perception, our human body, and our human mind, and our human scale, it's going to be very difficult to conceive and basically inconceivable to imagine what it's like to to be the awareness that's conscious of coherent units that are at higher scales, right? Whatever all this is a part of, that we're a part of, because of literally our the limits of our human scale. When you know how small we are, then you have to literally accept that it's going to be basically inconceivable what that is. And this is the thing of humility in terms of understanding the limits of human awareness, right? Like the idea that we could be totally 100% predict with absolute certainty what's going to happen at this, the idea of the Laplace way back in the day, the beginning of determinism was like, yes, given the perfect inputs, we could 100% predict what would happen all through for the rest of eternity. We have to understand the extreme limits of our ability to perceive. Right? We are minuscule, but we are minuscule in comparison to the universe, and we are enormous in comparison to our neurons. It's just a matter of we have a certain consciousness that, of course, by accumulating our history of thinking and all this stuff, we are expanding, continually expanding our ability to perceive, and as each human being's ability to expand its consciousness, right? By looking to the past and looking at understanding all these different things, and also just the accumulated memory that comes through the succession of generations and experiences that we have in this time. But we have to also accept the limits of that, which is that it is inconceivable. The universe to us at that scale is inconceivable in terms of imagining what it's like to be something at the scale of like that, for which a day is one cycle of the Milky Way, or whatever these cycles are that are the larger scale, that fit in a coherent form, that have these actions that we perceive, that we can see happening at smaller scales and we can presume are happening at larger scales. For us, it's inconceivable. Just like it's basically inconceivable to know what it's like to be a cell, because we're thinking from a human consciousness. Like, think about it like this. A lot of people, like, someone said to me, "Oh, I'd love, I'd love to know what it's like to be a dog," and I was thinking, the funny thing about that statement is that as soon as you transported your consciousness into a dog's body, you wouldn't really know what it was like to be a dog. You would be the dog, because you would be in its. You wouldn't know what it was like to be you in the dog. You wouldn't just be a dog, because you'd be within its mind, and you would just be being a dog, dogging around. And it's the same for all things. Our consciousness is in our minds and in our bodies. We are aware of it, but the awareness itself isn't the consciousness we think it is. It's our self. The awareness is already in the dog. That's what we recognize as life in a dog, is that it's aware. It's like there. It's like, oh, hey, dog. But if you couldn't put yourself into a dog's body and then come back and remember what that was like, because you would be the dog at that state, and you wouldn't be in your consciousness. You'd be in the dog's consciousness. And this is the same with all the different forms of consciousness, right? Like, this is an extrapolation, but this is worth considering, that when we're talking about all this stuff and we get into these ideas of infinite consciousness and all this stuff, we have to be aware that it's basically inconceivable of what of the consciousness of the highest form, literally the most largest scale coherent form of which we're a part, is inconceivable. Just like it's inconceivable to be of what it's like to be an atom or something like that, because we are seeing it from the consciousness that is scale dependent. It's dependent on our scale and on the information that we accumulate in order to do pragmatically what we're doing at the scale in the metabolic processes of the earth and the ecosystem and the larger thing that we're a part of. So that's worth considering. Now, I threw this in here, Whitehead, because what Whitehead describes is, and I'm this Whitehead was a mathematician. He helped write the Principia Mathematica at Oxford with Bertrand Russell, and like this was like one of the most logical guys ever, at least in English philosophy and Western philosophy over the past 100, 200 years, right? And I would look into him, maybe you've already heard of him, made some of the most complex but also like mystical sounding conclusions, right? He made a whole system that takes into account this motion of time. But the only thing I want to bring out here for the next point is his idea of what he called actual occasions of experience, what he described as sort of the units of time, right? And what he said is the requirement is that there's the past accumulating, and that has a prehension of a future becoming, right? If you look at what's going on right now, there's an accumulated past that is existing right now in this present that you're in. and you're a part of, and you are projecting potential future outcomes, and through your action you're creating the future. So this is the he called it concrescence, the becoming of the materialization of potential into the present moment to add to the accumulated past, as a way of framing what is going on in the present. Because again, this is the thing. This is where we're going to get into free will and all this stuff. I've sort of it's I've had to sort of talk a little bit about it because it all feeds into itself and it all is interrelated. But this model is extremely useful. The actual occasions of experience, the idea of prehension, the idea that really at the most basic level, what's happening in any occasion of experience or moment of time duration. And then there's another guy called Arthur Young, whom I can't remember the name of his book, but he invented the Young, like Young. It's really worth looking up. He invented the helicopter rotor blade. The motor that makes helicopters possible. I think he worked at Los Alamos as well. He was a proper physicist recently, and he put this same Bergsonian notion into his theory of the way that atoms work. And I'm telling you, this is the new paradigm. I'm just explaining it to you, okay? Because it's the truth, and that's why I'm trying to get this across. That this is just the case. I'm not inventing any of this stuff. I'm just putting it together for anyone who's interested. He made a model of atoms where he called it the learning cycle, right? So how do we account for time's motion? And he called it a learning cycle. And this is, again, this we're going to get into other things, because having done all this in 2017, I also went and studied with a Taoist priest, because I could see that this is in Taoist philosophy, and it just happens to be that Taoism has the most well kept history of this stuff, and it feeds into how you should live and all this stuff. But the learning cycle itself that he applied to atoms is much like the Wu Qing in Taoism, which is the way that they go about. It's called the five element cycle that describes, but it describes basically the way that a year works. But again, we're looking at cycles of change, right? Units of change. But fundamentally, what they have is qualitative. They have qualitative stages, and then it repeats, right? Like a winter. And in that one quality, so think about a year, right? We can use the Wu Qing as a way of describing this, but that over the course of a year, what happens is you go from the cold period of winter. So we'll start in the winter. Then as spring comes, everything starts to warm up. Life comes alive. The trees start to grow. For example, things start to grow. We get to the point of summer when the growth takes its peak, and then we get to late summer where the peak intensifies. It gets too hot, and then it starts to recede. Right? We get the autumn period where the energy starts to move back down into the stem, and then we get back into winter where the cold rain comes and everything condenses into a harder moment. But at each cycle of the year, we get more accumulation of growth within, say, like a forest or something. And that's, again, what is happening in any unit of time. We have this moment of the accumulation of the past, the addition of the present, and in with the experience factor, that there is a series of virtual possibilities that are actualized in the present by units who are acting, which is like us, for example. So now we talk about free will. So we understand that the linear model of time creates and mechanistic view of nature creates the idea of pure determinism, right? And so does also, interestingly, like extreme religion also creates. But interestingly, if you look, as we looked at the last presentation, both of those have a common theme, which is that both of those are used within social hierarchical structures. And so maybe there's a reason that they believe those things, right? But let's just say that, for example, we take this new model, which is understanding time from the direct experience of it, and then that's supported by non-linear functions, and we can see that these things actually model nature. Then what does that mean? If you have a linear view of time, it means that the future's already there and everything's given, and so the past, it doesn't matter. Basically, you can't do anything. Free will doesn't exist, right? There's no action happening. It's just things are just. It's just already given, and it's very defeatist. But there also, this is what I'm saying. You've got to understand. You've got to, from a Nietzschean perspective, which is one of the greatest philosophers of our time, you have to you really have to question what are the motivations of the person saying the theory, like what are their motivations. And same with Freud. That Freud was very much a Nietzschean, and I don't know if he ever gave him the credit, but it's what Freud was basically doing was building off of Nietzsche and pointing out all these underlying mechanisms that are driving people's behavior. But then also the fact that he named it as the unconscious is it gives you you need to really look at what people's motivations are. So if someone who's pushing certain theories and they are also financially supported by those theories, then you've got to question, like what's their motivation? Why would it be good for someone to say that everything's determined, right? If you're at the top of a company, like if you were, it would be good to think that the world is mechanistic if you're sort of seeing people as part of a mechanism that's making you money. So anyway, just as a fact, the linear model of time creates the idea of extreme determinism. Um, but if we look at a nonlinear function model of time using Whitehead's also a bit of Whitehead in there, which is again he was a mathematician and Leibniz was also a mathematician, and they have a lot of similarities in their thing. Bergson was also a mathematician at first, and they both all switched to philosophy. But if we take the nonlinear model of time, okay, what does that give us in terms of free will? Well, we understand that the future is there in possibility, right? The fact is, on an arithmetic model, a linear model, the at stage 10, point 10 of time, you can calculate that from the present just by applying the arithmetic, right? But the thing that's different with a nonlinear function is that in order for you to actually calculate what happens at stage 10, you have to do all the calculations of the preceding stages because of the nature of how they work. Each repetition requires that each stage be calculated, which means that if you want to know what it's like to be at a point in the future, it requires all the calculation of all the moments that happened previously, which means that you literally have to live through each moment. But what does that mean? It means that the view of determinism based on purely the principle of the model of time is the future in a nonlinear model exists, but it needs to be actualized, and the actualization process happens through the actor in the present, right? The conscious being. We are at each moment part of creating time happening. So what we do is creates the new step in time. So what does that mean? That our actions are creating the future, right? We are here in the present. We are part of this whole thing, just like a cell is a part of a body, and we are creating the future through our actions, right? So that basically implies, and it means that fundamentally what's going on is that action, that future is created by things that are coherent units within scales and structures that are acting and doing things, and we are part of that. So yes, we are doing things and our actions are creating the future, and it's not, the future isn't already determined. It exists in possibility. It logically exists, but it's not been actualized yet, because the actualization requires the actions of all the individual units within that. And you can go down to the cellular level and say that at what's happening within our bodies on each day is cellular, but it's also affected by the sun and everything. So there's this uh, fractal scale dependent and also realistically happening interaction between the smallest particles units and the largest units. We're affected by the sun, but we're also affected by the quality of our cells. Our cells are affected, are doing their actions, but they're also affected by our consciousness. For example, if you look at like the placebo effect, or even our actions. Our If we decide to go to Antarctica tomorrow, then then our cells are going to have to act differently. That's our actions, but then also depending on how they act, it's going to affect our consciousness. Like if they don't respond quick enough, we're going to get cold. We're going to be distracted and stuff. So, and that's going to affect our outcomes. So there's this give and take between larger and smaller scales, all acting in harmony, but also affecting each other, right? In the present. Fundamentally, the present moment is the moment of actualization of all the past, and we are part of that at our scale within our realms of what we're doing. So that goes into the time and eternity aspect. Okay, so we experience our scale of time. For us, I mean, it's an interesting thought, and it's just something that I'm going to start with as a bit of a side point. But if you think about eternity. There's an interesting factor. If you think about one day as just a unit of time, right? You wake up, you come out of unconsciousness, you wake up, you're here, and you're like, oh yeah, you literally come out of nothingness. You don't know what the fuck's going on. You're asleep. And you appear in your bed, and you do your day. You have all this stuff going on, like all your programs running that tell you what you're going to do, and through your memory, and then you go to sleep at night into again oblivion. So in a weird way, a day is sort of like a model of a lifetime. But we perceive a life. We have our scale of time perception, right? We have the experience of our life. That's our band of time, and we take all our actions within that time, and that's it as far as we know. But I mean, obviously, everything's happening in the present, and we can infer, since we know that there were smaller things living their little lives in our bodies, and we can see that we're on something bigger. That fundamentally, we can assume that there are scales at which there is a coherent unit taking actions that are far vaster than our life scale. So, like for that, like and I don't know it, but you can infer that at some point, right, there is the fullness in completion of a cycle of the largest scale unit of what we're a part of, and that's incompletion, right? So there is that, and that's happening now fundamentally as we're a part of it, right? We are a single unit in the present moment, acting as a part of a larger unit and formed of smaller units, all of which working in harmony at different scales of time, right? And we're just aware of this life scale that we have in our daily, basically daily, a day as the primary unit, 3,600 days is a lifetime. That's what they say in Taoism. Again, and we're going to go into all this stuff. This is basically a preamble to talk about more deeper esoteric stuff and to see what actually makes sense. And also, it gives an explanation of how this stuff is so accurate. And this is a total side point. But yes, eternity exists, but it's also everything happens in the present, right? The present moment is the actualization of all the past and the creation of future possibilities. We are living in as one cycle. Our lifetime is one cycle of basically infinite in both directions scales of cycles that are all nested and interconnected. And we can infer by looking to the smaller scales and seeing that there are smaller things, and by mathematical modeling, which describes the action of time, we see that there has this quality, that there is a zoom out and a zoom in, and there's there's spheres of coherence at different dimensions. This is a funny new turn on the phrase dimension, but it actually fits it. Where if you think about, you change your scale, the scale of your viewing aperture by zooming in on the fractal generator, and you're actually changing your dimensions, right? So at different dimensions of scale, there are coherent units happening. Fundamentally, the time is eternal in the sense that it's continuously going and it does exist, but the present is the moment of actualization, and that's what we're in now, and that's what we're doing. We're actualizing the future. We are one with the creation of the universe, and that's it. So, and that feeds into this, and then it's the last bit. Yes, it feeds into this because now we have this thing of all this so much talk about, divinity and all this stuff. And, you know, gods, the God, conscious, cosmic consciousness, God, and we're gods and all this stuff. But I just want to say from a really down to earth level that yes, we are one element of the actualizing process of creation in the universe, right? That is our presumably what we're doing here, right? Just by looking, using all the information we have, that seems to be the case, that we are part of this process that's creating the material world through our actions, right? Through our awareness. We are part of the creative process. Now, I don't want to get too much into, because again, there's so much moral and all these implications of the idea of divinity and all this stuff, and also everything from religion, and I don't want to get into a moral thing, but if we want to take the sort of detached approach to understanding how did we fit into this, right? We can assume that there is higher forms of consciousness just by looking. We don't you don't have to think anything, but fundamentally we can see that that is very much probably the case, that there are higher forms of which we're a part, but that we are a part of them, right? And that being the case, like our cells are a part of us, from the non sort of like moralizing aspect of divinity and stuff. What does this all mean, right? We are very likely we are part of the creative aperture of the universe, but we have the choice, right? There is a qualitative and effective. The nature of qualitative experience is that our feelings are a huge part of it, right? And the feelings that we are the intentions that we have with our actions will lead to outcomes that we can define, right? Like if you act out of hatred, generally you're going to cause destruction. If you act out of love, generally you're going to cause creation, like create new lives or create something beautiful or something that is enduring and has a unifying quality. So this is all the stuff that requires so much elaboration that there's no I'm not claiming or even pretending that I know half of any of what the truth is about this stuff, but I'm just pointing out that this is a new way of seeing things that everyone's pretty much already doing. It's just not clear why it's the case. There's a lot of confusion, and that is all clarified by remodeling the way that we use time, and then by recognizing that this non-linearity is literally potentially the structure of how reality grows, then all the implications that come from that, right? So I'm not telling you to think anything for yourself. I mean, I'm not telling you to think anything. I'd say think for yourself. And I'm saying that these sorts of conclusions are going to require a century to parse out into something that's really has any significance to it, like in terms of certainty. But what I'm saying is that we can pretty much assume that yes, we are part. Like, okay, if you say that we are a piece of God or whatever, but what is God but the creator, and what is creation but the actualization of possibilities in the present moment by the whole of the universe? And that's what we're a part of. That's what you're doing, that's what I'm doing, that's what we're doing every single day. And if you want to put some kind of like high vibrational spin on it, the way to see that is that if you're going to be creating, if your actions are 99% of the time based out of hatred, which is also fear, or that sort of impulse towards the material body and safety of the safety of the material body, and taking away from others, then that's going to create certain outcomes. If your actions are generally towards unity and helping and loving, then that's going to lead to another set of outcomes, right? Like you could, if you want to go dualistic with it, then yes, love and hate uh, are qualities of your intent that could define the way that you contribute to the creation of the universe through your specific instance of conscious being. But that's totally up to you. That's the thing. Like, it's up to you. And there's obviously all the aspects of all the things people have done to you and all the things that have happened that might define the way that you do it and the way you've been treated and the things you've seen and all this stuff. And that's just part of the nature of being in this body. But what I'm saying is that there's literally no confusion. There's no duality between individual consciousness and the idea of universal consciousness. We're just looking at different scales of perception, right? So the same way that the neurons that give you your feeling or the cells in your body are experiencing, we are experiencing compared to something that's much larger, but at the same time, they're all creating. And if they're in a good state, then they're creating positive energy. And that's health, right? So it's these are things that you personally need to explore in your own intuition and in your mind. And again, I'm going to get into further stuff about just clearing up these really silly confusions that we all have because we're basically been taught stuff and from questionable sources, right? Like with questionable reasons. And I'm just stating the fact that it's very likely that this is the case, that we are conscious, just like smaller scale things are conscious, and larger scale things are conscious, based on the fact that nonlinearity and nonlinear functions seem to be models of reality, that they model time, that we are literally units of time, accumulating it and acting it and creating our lives and the things around us, in influencing the field that we're in. And so it's very likely the case that, yes, there is a larger consciousness and that we're a part of it. But there's no tension. There's no reason why there can't be an individual consciousness and a larger consciousness. In fact, it's given by the nature of all of the information that we have that it's probably the case, and it's probably necessarily the case, because otherwise, what would we be doing here? Um, if you have to see the scale of the universe, assume that our collective actions can be viewed from some perspective as a unified whole, and that unified whole is amongst others that are part of something bigger, and that thing can be perceived from another coherent perception that would give it a new spin that we can't conceive of. But nonetheless, we are a part of this thing. We are doing it, and we are taking actions and creating the world. We are creating the future. You are creating your future and the future of the world in every single moment, and you can't do anything other than that, regardless of what anyone says. Okay, so I mean, I pretty much have already gone through this, but I'm just going to try and like put this argument into the most simplified shorthand possible, just to get it across the point, right? We have all these confusions in our current collective worldview, and every people, because of the introduction of psychedelics and the integration of Eastern cultures and the practices, many people have practiced many of these things and had many experiences that are totally unexplainable, and are doing things that are unexplainable, like Wim Hof and stuff like that. And they all say certain stuff. And it seems to be the case that our collective understanding is now becoming aware of a certain nature of reality that our abstract models that we're using don't account for. But being it also that the case that that those thinking patterns are so instantiated into the power structure, which basically controls who gets resources and who doesn't, that it creates the problem of basically ostracization and all this stuff for having different beliefs. So people, so and also so fear, the fear of that causes people to hold on to these beliefs. But then we get all really confused, like, wait, how, what? Doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense. That is based on errors that came from the past that we talked about in the other lectures, things about the nature and of how space and time are structured, and how we are abstractly forming that, how we are laying that out in our minds, right? Because we have our mental space of abstraction, which creates our field of possibilities, and then we have the real experience of life as a purely qualitative experience through which we have a whole fuck ton more information, which is saying something different. And I'm saying that, and I'm just pointing out that the one of the biggest problems of that's causing all this confusion was identified by a man called Henri Bergson in like 1910, and people like Alfred North Whitehead took that on, and a number of other people have taken that on, and it hasn't gotten a big amount of public, like from the vast public, like mass adoption, but on the unconscious level, people on the whole basically understand this because it's come through. It's sort of fizzled into society enough that this is the collective understanding that we can see that actually the universe is not as we see it. The human isn't the epitome of the only conscious thing on the planet, and we don't have hold the whole of the universe in our minds. In a certain sense, we do, but in reality, in a way of conceptually, we it's our conceptual models are just a matter of our language, and our language is accumulated over history and our sciences and everything that we have. So our models are just basically imaginary, right? This is our imagination of how things works. Now, Bergson pointed out this thing that time itself is primary to our quantities and stuff like that, which are all in the abstract realm. Most time and in duration and qualitative change is actually a foundational primary source of all of our abstractions. So we can't apply an abstract frame to that phenomena that gives us the whole that gives us, that's the foundation for our abstractions in order to describe it, because it's a mistake in terms, right? It's a contradiction. In it's a false hierarchy. Basically, we've mistaken the model that we're using for the primary thing, whereas the primary thing itself is the source of the model. So then we have to say, so how can we measure, how can we model time in a way that's a little bit more accurate? And thanks to computers, we can see that fundamentally, well, no, we can use our intuition and our reason to see that time functions in a certain way, right? It accumulates, and in the present, all the accumulated past is present in the present moment, and that present interacts with the new data, and it affects it, and it's this sort of reciprocal moving back and forth of past infusing into the present, present being changed by that, and then that's a new piece of information to add into the past that goes into a new present, and it goes on like that. Um, Now, we can say that that is like a nonlinear equation, like the Fibonacci sequence, for example, where each part of each iteration requires that that the past iterations be applied, which means that the determinism and things like that are based on a linear model of time are inaccurate, because fundamentally, if you want to calculate all the everything that happens in time, you have to actually go through the time to add the accumulation. So the idea of pure predictability is out the window, because nonlinear equations are not predictable. They must be computed, right? So there's not the same level of predictability we thought. Also, by computer modeling these nonlinear functions, we've come to certain discoveries that these self-similar structures that we see. So if we then assume that time works like a nonlinear function, we look at the way it's modeled, we see that there are self-similar structures that change at scales, and we can assume that when we see cells that act similarly to beings within a hierarchies. If we look at the like single cellular organisms that act in what seem like social hierarchies and things like that, that we can assume we're the same, and we can also assume that on a larger scale that also exists. So each coherent unit having a purpose and a perspective based on its scale and its ability to accumulate memory, we are just one of those, right? So that applies both that it implies both that smaller things are consciousness and larger things are conscious, and that they're all together working towards whatever it is that this is all a part of, which to us is basically inconceivable, because um, we don't have the structures to accumulate those scales of time in order to get a snapshot that's suitable or sufficient in order to understand what it is to be at a larger scale or at a smaller scale. We are limited by our consciousness to this scale in terms of our coherence. This is what's coherent, but we can imply by looking not only mathematically at what we see qualitatively from looking at these equations, but also just like by looking, we can see that this is likely the case, right? And that based on using this model, we can see also that the present is the moment of actualization. This is the time where the iteration is happening, and there are virtual possibilities by the fact that we will continue to iterate the function, but the the future outcomes are only given with once all the stages have been properly calculated, which means that time itself, the future isn't predictable. Um, there are different scales of consciousness, and it's all scale bound based on the apparatus we're seeing through. So the confusion about what it is to be a cell, or like how could it be conscious, that's just our mental confusion, because we're thinking about human consciousness and not from the point of just awareness, because awareness would be aware of that scale of memory, and it would that awareness would harmonize that thing in a way that it's suitable for its function, like we're suitable for our function. It's just hard to know what that is from our perspective, because we can't look from the larger perspective until time and our information that we've accumulated is enough to get a good picture, which is why it's worth studying history and looking through all these ideas and stuff, because you get a larger perspective and it gives you more perspective on the present. So basically, this is it. Okay, so it's a lot to take on, but I would say if you've watched all this, then nice one. And I've also written a lot of stuff. Like I said, this came to me or became apparent to me in 2017. And since then, it's I've been looking to try and make sense of it and say, how does this apply? And it leads you down a lot, and they're not rabbit holes. This is it leads you to start looking into the ancient belief systems, and then you can understand them on a different level. Like, how, think about it, how do you understand time qualitatively? Well, the Taoists do. How is it that they how have people calculated events in the future using astrology, or like Vedic astrology and all these things? How is it that they have some way of predicting what's going to happen? But if you then look at it as they're actually defining qualitative fields during different times of cycles, larger and smaller cycles that affect the qualitative structure of experience, basically. So this is something that is going to come about, right? This is because it's the logical conclusion to all the information that we have. It's just not very clear, because, well, not many people are taking all the time to do all the reading, and basically it has no practical use except for to your own self and your amount of freedom that you live with in yourself and your understanding and your connection to the higher scale of the universe. But I just want to leave you with this, because in Taoism, this is one thing that also they say that our body is a model of the universe. If we want to do the best that we can, first we have to perfect our body, and then we have to perfect our family, and then we have to perfect our community, and then our country, and then the world, right? So they have this idea is understood because this can be seen by your awareness when you're willing to look at what's actually there. And there are many places this can go, but in conclusion, I would say this: when people say time is nonlinear, and it makes you think all this crazy stuff, just think back to this. And if you want to watch it back or whatever, if you actually care that much, that's cool. Do watch it back, because it's the case. It's just the case that the best way to model time as we know it from our experience, just by observing what happens, is that it's a nonlinear function. If when we iterate nonlinear functions and then we put that graphically, we see natural forms, and then since we have the ability to change in scales through those simulations, we can see that there are these scales of coherence that are at vastly larger and smaller scales, and that they're similar. This not scale invariant self similarity. So we can infer from our experience here at this time in this place with our body and our mind that those where we see these coherent forms that we recognize as something coherent going around doing something like a little cell or a, you know organelle within a cell, that they have a similar sort of experience to ours, but it's, again, it's not the same. When we're talking about panpsychism and stuff like that, it's we have to recognize that our understanding is extremely biased just by the only access we have to consciousness is through our mind. But when people who do go through the sort of contemplative practices deep enough will see that there is a difference between the awareness and what it's aware of. And what we are aware of is a human version of this at a human scale, doing human things. And that's our, if we try and put that as all of what consciousness is, then you get confused when you try and start thinking about larger and smaller scales. And you have to take on the humility to say, we probably don't know anything. Like, our capacity to know anything is basically zero. Like, our capacity to know the extent of what we can know of the universe is like so infinitesimally small that it's not even worth putting a number to. You have to just assume that you could know absolutely nothing. If you know enough to make things work to your extent, or to feel comfortable, or to have some like nice vision of the universe, then that's great and that's fine. And that needs to be recognized on the whole, because it's just the case. Like, it's very likely that there are units of consciousness or conscious beings that like we would call it, that are so much larger than us that we're a part of. And it's inconceivable for us to imagine that we'd know what it was like, but what we can infer in terms of our relationship to the whole universe is that our actions and the intent behind our actions will have a qualitative effect on the world around us. And what quality do you want to put into it? That's the major conclusion, right? Like, but it's all free. You're free. We're all free to do as we please. But you notice over time, and it's worth going and listening to different forms of the philosophies to see what they suggest about what the right way to go about operating this vehicle is, because they lead to different conclusions. And Yeah, so that's I'm going to leave it at that today. I hope it has been interesting. I hope it's been enlightening, and I will see you on the next one.